Welcome, I'm Joshua Freedman, your host of EQ Biz Live. We're here to talk about the chaos that we're in business and how we can equip ourselves, our communities, our employees, our teams to find a way through this hopefully temporary period that we're in, but maybe this is the new normal. Ugh, what if it is? And this level of distress and complexity and the rapid pace of change is just going to continue. It's demanding something different from us as business leaders. It's demanding us to step up and step in and learn new ways of operating. Our old ways of strategy are not going to work if we're really in this level of complexity. Last year, US Surgeon General came out with a report on workplace mental health and well-being. We recently had the Chief Human Resource Officer of Microsoft say we're in a global human energy crisis. We have deep challenges in our workplaces with people. And people are more stressed, they're more lonely, they're more disconnected than ever in the history of measuring those things. And as leaders, we're going to have to figure out how to shift the way we engage human energy. So we have a fantastic panel here for you. We'd love to have you interact and ask questions, join the conversation in the chat. Let's bring in our panelists, and we're going to start with an opening question for them to introduce themselves. And so, folks, thank you for being here today and sharing your insight and experience from the real world of business. What's one way you've seen business change in the last 3 years? So it seems like there's like this bright, shiny line of pre-2020 and post-2020 in my mind. How about for you as a business leader? Abner, let's start with you. What's something that's changed? Oops, don't forget to unmute yourself.
Thanks for inviting me to join the conversation. As founder and CEO of a company in the healthcare technology space, I'd say a major thing that has changed, and I think the other panelists will probably share this view, is this move to remote work and the fact that some aspect of remote work is here to stay. It's not going away. And trying to recruit and manage a remote workforce is something I think everyone's struggling with. And I know we're going to talk about that, but that is one thing that we have experienced. We are all remote now, and we're not going back. And so we are remote to stay. And the challenges are many. And so I'd love to dive into that more.
Thanks, Abner. Chantal?
Thanks. Pleasure being here. As a senior HR leader in the hospitality industry, just a couple of things that we've started to notice is employee well-being, definitely talent attraction and retention, as Abner had mentioned, so definitely echo that. But also just the ways of travel. So we were one of the mostly affected, and now we're pretty much booming. So we're struggling to match guest expectations, customer expectations versus our employees' expectations. So it's going to be an interesting one this evening to see how we navigate through that.
Ekta.
Pleasure to be on the panel, Josh. Thanks for the invitation. So as a CHRO and a healthcare HR practitioner, I've been in the healthcare industry for close to 2 decades now. The last 3 years, the HR business is shifting just to keep up with how the healthcare business is shifting. So the healthcare model was going towards value-based care prior to the pandemic. And what got added was fast digitization and distributed care in healthcare. So for us in human resources, the need to adapt our staffing models and our systems and our procedure at that same pace, right? When the pace is really, really very fast, that's really, really a big challenge. So I would say creating a self-sustaining and digitally enabled, well-oiled talent pipeline, right? Where culture is actually an incentive, because when you talk about recruitment, retention, engagement, motivation, culture has to be an incentive. It's not a choice anymore. And how do you keep that culture while there's such a fast pace going on? So that's basically the biggest challenge for us at this time.
David.
Yeah, thank you. So as a former entrepreneur who now acquires stuck startups and helps turn them into sustainable, healthy companies. So I work more on the startup side of things, and I would agree with what's been said. And let me try to add a little bit of flavor to it from my end, which is that I feel like we are simultaneously dealing with the obvious distributed at-home workforce and working everywhere. But to me, it's the biggest challenge really comes down to how do we develop a level of humanness in these companies? How do we have a sense of connection and compassion that didn't exist before because we didn't need it as much? That is really, really required to not only keep the employees healthy and happy, but support the profitability and health of the business ongoing as well. So I think it's brought up a lot of really critical issues that you have no choice but to deal with, at least in the companies that I work with.
Well, I'd love to have anybody in the chat who's here share with us your answer. What are you identifying as significant changes over the last 3 years in your work and work life? Jeff, I'd like to have you introduce yourself in 1 second and share what's one of the things you heard from our panelists. One of the things that I heard is about the pace of change. I remember a cartoon saying, what enabled your digital transformation strategy? Chief technology officer, new products, COVID. And it's like, we went through so much rapid transformation that we just didn't have a choice. And it was do or die, literally for our businesses. And so we did. And everybody was doing that. And we, pivot. I got so tired of the word unprecedented times. And yet, that's the reality. And I think we still are there. And so we've had all this rapid transformation and pivoting, and people are tired. And yet we still have more transformation. Jeff, what's something you heard?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Just say hello to everyone. I'm Jeff Kinsley, Director of Business for 6 Seconds for the Americas. Glad to be with everyone in this great panel today. The word I picked up on was our talent. We have to look at our talent pipelines differently. We have to look at how we motivate and engage our talent. To Abner's point, this is life now. So how do we develop our talent? How do we know who our next successors are? And Ekta talked about our talent has to be culture driven. So, now we're looking at talent more so than, hey, we slot this person in this position, they're on this box and on the 9 block, hey, they're the next person. But now it's become almost holistic. How do they fit in? What is the culture? Can they work from home? Can they motivate people? Can they reach out, touch, and become empathetic with people's feelings, even though they may be doing it virtually? So all of these concerns I heard from everyone, and that talent, how we really deal with in the future is what resonated with me.
I'm bringing a couple of comments from the chat. I think, Frank, this is a really intriguing challenge. And Abner alluded to this. Others mentioned the way we engage and recruit people. It's probably not going to work the way we did it before, given how much of the workforce is now saying, look, I don't want to come to the office and I have a choice. I don't have to. Abner will hire me. And then Jeremy, as you said, and I think somebody else, I think David said this, it's not that this wasn't true before. It's that it's became so much in our faces in the last few years that the relational context that we establish in our organizations, it's no longer optional. And from Korea, welcome Dae Young. Wow. Anyone have a thought? Like, this hurts me. Anyone have a thought about what Dae Young is saying here? Ekta, what do you think? In your organization, how would you feel if you heard this from your employees?
Well, safety certainly has been the conversation amongst many others in healthcare, especially because we are on the end of providing the care, right? So how does it impact you when you have to be there? You don't have a choice to stay away and, just stay inside the house. You have to be there providing care. When it comes to trust factor, certainly in my healthcare experience the last 3 years, it's actually well said. That has been our reality. The safety concerns have been at the top of employees' mind, their families' mind, and the onus is on the employer to constantly ensure and assure the employees that we are taking all the measures needed to ensure that you're safe, and we need you here to provide the care that we need you to provide. Now, what does that do to the culture if prior to the pandemic, your culture lacked trust? If it wasn't the key factor, the employer-employee relationship, right, was not built on trust or was not built on a communication mechanism where you have a listening culture, right? You're seen as a compassionate employer, you're seen as empathetic, and you're seen as keeping the employees' interests at the top of everything else business, right? Then now proving yourself that your safety is our, first and foremost interest, it's going to be very challenging because now you're building that trust, right? You didn't have that to begin with. Of course, a lot of healthcare organizations have moved ahead on that curve of building trust because you have to, if you want, your employees to provide the care that was needed during the pandemic. But I think the journey is still ongoing. The journey is still ongoing. And even if we say we've come out of the pandemic, if we say this is the post-pandemic era, it has brought to the surface the empathy, the compassion, the human piece of relationship and, going beyond the perks and the wages and, what is in an employment relationship. It's really, really here to stay because that's how your value proposition is going to be, evaluated in the employer-employee relationship.
David, you work with a lot of entrepreneurs, people who are CEOs, creators, inventors of things. They're starting businesses. How many of them think that my top priority is building a great culture and great relationships?
Quite a few, actually. It's become pretty common these days. I think what's happening is I think the pandemic brought what was under the surface for a long time, which is, humans have this need for meaning in our lives. It's just part of who we are, right? We want to know why we're here and that there's a reason for our existence all the time, right? And so capitalism makes that hard because basically you're saying, your raison d'etre as a human is to be the means of production. And I think that's really a hard thing to tell people. And I think they're waking up to that fact. So it's okay to be the means of production. It's okay to have a job and support the profitability of a business if it is in exchange for some element of human growth. In other words, you're going from this place of trying to convince people that the best thing to happen to them is this job and that should be their purpose to, hey, do this job for us and I'll give you the environment in which you can grow as a person and that you can have a good life and that we can support each other and you can feel a sense of connection. So I think the pandemic just brought that all to the fore, and we're starting to see that. And so if you don't take people and culture into account as the primary, then, it's really going to be hard to build a sustainable business. Now, AI is a different thing, which we can make a different point, right? Because a lot of these jobs are going to go away. But, for right now, and certainly where I work in software primarily, it's all about the people. And unless you find ways to keep them aligned with meaning and purpose and connection and feeling a sense of being alive and being human in the context of work, it's almost impossible to keep them.
What a stunning thing to say about software, right? I live down the street from Silicon Valley, and it was not the way it was 15 years ago, right? It was like, we need rockstar coders and we're fighting over rockstar coders. And now there's a shift in awareness. Abner, what about for you? You're a CEO, you're trying to keep your company thriving and aliving. What's kind of challenging you as a leader in this conversation?
I think one of the things that I want to add to the conversation, and it's certainly something that we're experiencing as a venture-backed company and a technology company, things have just changed dramatically in terms of expectations for the company's performance. We went from a period of the expectations for us were all about growth, addressing a large market and growing quickly, almost overnight in 2020. And it happened so quickly that it has just shocked, I think, a lot of everyone. The focus changed from being exclusively on growth to profitability. And so so at the end of sort of as we were coming out of COVID, and we had a lot of the lessons that we had learned about how to treat employees and how to build a more inclusive team and to make people feel secure. It has largely been undone by the rounds of let's use the real term layoffs. They call them reductions in force to try to make it sound nice, but it's laying people off. And in technology, it's been one round after another round after another round. We had to do it. We had to do it ourselves. It has been a really difficult period, and so. You have sort of two things happening at the same time: a remote workforce that we're trying to build trust with and trying to make people feel like they're part of a team. At the same time, we are forcing them to go through this really pretty painful experience, and we can't even know if this is the last round. If you look at some of the big technology companies, they've done 3 and 4 rounds of layoffs, and it's unclear when it's going to end. So I want us to put that on the table because it is part of the context here of building trust and making and creating an environment where employees feel secure. It's hard to do that when you're in the kind of environment we're in. I don't have all the answers, but I certainly want to put it out there that this is real for us and a lot of companies.
So one of the economic uncertainty going on and on and on is maybe leading investors and others to say, I need returns faster. I can't wait because this environment is risky. And that's certainly one of the driving pressures right now. Chantal, let's move over to the UAE and the Middle East region. And we have a really different economic situation there. What is the kind of pressure that you're seeing in the environment? What are the biggest challenge?
Well, we certainly have social and cultural shifts. We work with multicultural environments, mostly expat communities. So what works for one doesn't necessarily work for another. So how do you define trust? How do you define purpose? How do you ensure that there is an alignment to those goals and expectations? But also noting that our customers come from worldwide backgrounds and economic. So how do you then match all of these different elements together, still keeping a happy workforce, a happy guest, a happy consumer that then returns on your business, gives that return on investment for you? So it is quite challenging. How do we skill share? 70% of our organizations are millennials. They're looking for different ways of working compared to what was previously or historically known. So how do you still keep them growing? How do you keep them sustained and engaged? And it's not necessarily your rewards and recognition. There are other factors that they're looking for. And one of those main ones are well-being, engagement, work-life balance. How do you incorporate that? So there is quite a few things that do elevate, but also detract from the experience. But one of the great things is that if you're able to go down to that root, you're able to see how you can change that fruit, right? So how do you change what is being presented or what comes forward? And that's one of the things that we as an organization, even in the Middle East, are looking at. How do we dig down and delve down deeper?
So I'm hearing conflicting priorities. And again, it's something that's always been true in business and everywhere in our life. We have competing commitments. Ekta, let's go back to you one more time. What would you say is the top pressure in business right now?
Well, there isn't one. There are many, right? If we stay with the digitization, if we stay with, how digitization is impacting businesses, and healthcare has been impacted big time with the digitization, the pace with which the business was planning to go telehealth, like manifold. I mean, overnight businesses had to shift, and it was like you didn't even need a 10-year strategy to do that. Just COVID coming in made you do that like quickly, right? So from a pressure perspective, I think one of the biggest technological advancements certainly is one of the biggest pressure, because it's not just that you adapted, but there's sustainability and there's a scalability issues. And then there is, as your business grows with technology and technology grows with business, keeping the same pace for your workforce, their upskilling, their training, constantly staying on top of the competition you're in the market, right? And ensuring that their employee value proposition, they feel they're working they're not working at an employer, that's like 10 years behind in technology. So the digitization certainly I would keep that as the top pressure. Now, from the perspective of the shrinking margins, because I am in healthcare, right? So cost has been a huge challenge in healthcare, especially in healthcare, the reimbursement costs are declining, right? And the distributed care model that I talked about is impacting the staffing model. Home health, certainly telehealth. So it's a distributed care. It's not necessarily on site in the hospital or in the clinic, which is impacting the staffing model. So the pressure from that perspective is communication. I mean, we have opened up way more channels of communication than we could have thought about prior to the pandemic. And yet it's not enough. And it's adding on to the complexity and the pressures, because communication is so key to how to keep your employees engaged. How do you get your message to them? How do you tell them we have revisited our EVP, the value proposition, and we're not the same employer anymore, right? How do you shift that perception? And it's the biggest channel for your culture change, if your culture change is needed. I think it's one of the biggest pressure. How do you find balance in that communication and you keep up with what you have to communicate, and how do you listen back? Another thing that I think with all of these changes has happened is managing the workflows. Because one of the biggest disconnect that happens, which impacts your motivation of employees, the teamwork, the culture, the engagement, everything, right, that you talk about, is their workflows and their day-to-day. How are they working? So with so much change in what's outside of technology, what's in the technology, virtual teams, half on-site, half off-site, hybrid working models, managing the workflows to keep the channels of communication open is such a daunting task. You just don't know. You've just launched a new workflow process and there are multiple people touching it. Are you reaching everybody at the same time? Do you know their pain points, right? And you don't know until you do a survey and you get back your results, and gosh, you have a disengaged workforce. And
so the more successful David and Abner are, the harder your job is.
probably.
I mean, this pace, right? There's no way to keep
No.
up with this pace of digitalization.
No.
We're going to go to the topic of engagement in a second that Jeremy asked about. I'll bring that into the on stage in a second. But before we do that, Jeff, what David talked about this basic human needs of meaning, of growth. What stood out for you in that?
I totally agree with what David's saying. If you would have asked me 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have agreed with him. I don't feel like maybe not 5 years, but 10 years ago, culture was not the thing. It was productivity. It was being a part. It was having that next gig, moving to the next level. It was all about really going. Companies talked about culture. People talked about culture, but they didn't live culture. And I think during the pandemic, and in 6 seconds, we have some numbers that show this. In 2017, we measure empathy, and the empathy numbers were pretty low. I'm not going to get into details, but what we saw during the pandemic is we saw those empathy numbers dramatically rise. Why? Because it wasn't about productivity. It wasn't about the dollar. It was about, we're going to survive this crisis. We're going to take care of everybody when we're in it. And a lot of businesses were very successful during that point. Well, guess what? We came out of the crisis, and now we've shifted back down to pretty near those 2017 levels in 2023. So we've kind of had that bubble for the crisis. And my concern is where culture is a thing, where people have seen empathy, where people have seen understanding, where people have seen a commitment to each other with the right kind of communications. Are we going to see a Groundhog Day where, yeah, this was good, it worked, but are we going to go back? Are we going to start talking about communication? For a lot of people, communication for many years was one way. It was directive communication. Does the workforce want that now? What type of communication do they want? Do they even want you to talk to them? It could be all digital. It could be text message. It could be message boards. It could be whatever. So to David's point, I think culture was a buzzword for a lot of executives and management. And now culture is the buzzwords for those people doing the jobs and having the purpose and finding out that purpose matches the culture where they exist. So, yeah, I think it's a huge topic for today.
I want to go to Jeremy's comment here, joining us from LinkedIn. Meaningful employee engagement. So Abner, let's start with you. I was shocked by this. When 20 years ago, I read Gallup's research about employee engagement, that roughly 25% of the workforce was engaged. And I'm like, wow, companies are gonna change. And this year, Gallup's research came out with the lowest engagement numbers in 20 years. Down to 21% in the US, 16% globally. In other words, roughly 80% of employees in America are not really wanting to go to work. Why hasn't it changed? Easy question.
It's a really good question, and I think a number of the comments earlier touch on this. We haven't done a very good job of doing what David mentioned, of creating an environment where work is about more than just making enough money so that you can have a life. It's almost like we've created a work situation that work is this unpleasant thing that you do in order to have a good life. And I think as long as it's perceived that way, we're going to really struggle to have people feel engaged and feel like they work for a company that's more than just a paycheck. And in fact, it's part of how they find meaning in their lives. Great companies have started to do that. I think a lot of that, frankly, was set back by the pandemic, because as we went virtual, a lot of the solutions that even the best companies had at creating that kind of work environment where it was about more than just a paycheck. I belong somewhere. This is my community. Work is part of the good life, not just how it funds the good life. A lot of the solutions that helped us get there required in-person interactions. We got some companies, not all, because as you said, Joshua, the numbers weren't that great before, but some companies got really good at creating that kind of workplace. But a lot of the solutions that they used involved in-person interactions. And I think the challenge that we have, that we face, this group and the folks listening, is we need better solutions. We don't have solutions that in my view, that are going to allow us to drive those numbers that you talked about, Joshua, drive those numbers up in the current environment where expectations are higher. Remote is going to be a big part of it. It's interesting. In my first years of the company, of my company, I knew all the employees. As we got bigger, certainly my managers had met in person. My managers had met in person and knew their employees. Now, not only have I never met them, but I have managers who have never met their employees, and people even at the next level of management who have never met in person. So we need better solutions. I love the technology that we have been able to, that allows us to have, meetings like this one, but it's not enough. We've got to do better. And I don't have I think I'm saying this more than I should. I don't have the solution, but I certainly know the problem. And it is that we have got to figure out a way to make people feel connected through digital. I'll stop there. That's the challenge. The old solutions that required human interactions were achieving a lot of results, but those solutions just aren't going to work anymore. And we've got to figure out how to do it using digital, because we're never going to go back to a point, I think, where your managers and folks, as you go down through the organization, actually know and meet in person and have a day-to-day or even a once a week kind of interaction in person. It's not going to happen, and so we've got to figure out how to manage successfully in that environment.
I have not had all of my employees in a room since 2004. We became a remote-first organization. And so in some ways that adaptation of the pandemic was not problematic for us. There were many other things that were problematic. But when I think about another solution, I don't think about technology. What about others? When you think about this question of finding new ways of engaging, what is the need? What is the opportunity? David?
Yeah, well, I would say that, this is in line with my other thoughts prior, but what you're seeing now, because people faced this crisis where life was kind of, dumped onto them in a pretty extreme way with COVID and everything else, and you saw the mental health and anxiety levels go way up, people started seeking out ways to deal with those, and they were seeking out things outside of their professional life to do meditation and inner work and therapy and all kinds of things that they weren't doing before. When you do that, you start realizing that you're kind of in the matrix, professionally, and it's very hard to go back. So in other words, when you spend enough time doing inner work and doing a lot of the therapy that people were doing, and then try to go back and it's Dilbert, right? That's not really going to work. People are not going to be happy. They're not going to be satisfied. So I think you have no choice but to break down these kind of stark delineations between people's personal and professional lives. And it has to get more real. I had an executive that worked for me, and he was an amazing executive in his realm, but broke so much glass with other people and was constantly just one of those problem children as it related to other people, but he was very productive. And I sent him to a week-long workshop that I had done, a kind of inner work retreat that was massively transformational for me. And I watched him go through this life-changing situation. And for $9,000, which is the cost of this program, he changed fundamentally and was a completely different person afterwards. And the level of connection that we had and that other people who started doing similar work had meant that inside the context of this business, we started being able to communicate and connect with each other at a level that had much more depth, much more humanness and compassion, and was just more real than we had ever had before. And I think we're going to have to get there. And I know it's probably going to be hard for the HR people to think about too, but because it's very hard to walk that fine line because you can easily kind of fall into dangerous territory. However, I don't see any other option than to embrace the human work and growth work that we all need to do, and the business needs to support that and to do it in healthy ways.
And Chantal, you have worked for years now on bringing emotional intelligence into the processes that you use. I just want to shout out Tasneen's comment here about people, this human piece, and how we focus on the human side of this interaction. Where does emotional intelligence play into this conversation we're having so far?
Whoa, that's definitely the question of the moment. At the end of the day, we're all people. People are going to need people to be around. You can't replace that with technology. You are going to need to have human connections and interactions. They are becoming harder because people obviously don't necessarily interact and engage in the same ways that they used to do before. But you need to be able to, and as HR leaders especially, we need to be able to bridge that gap. How do we bring that? Yes, there is that work-life balance, but your life is pretty much your work as well. So you need to be able to kind of marry those two things together, and working with emotional intelligence and introducing it in the organization itself. I'm lucky that I work in a people's business. Hospitality is all about the people, whether it's on the guest-facing side, whether it's on the employee side. But it's really about how do they understand what the guest might be going through when they're angry or when they're happy or when they're satisfied, versus how you are then performing or getting that perspective back on your end. How do you then get those elements to kind of work together and then still have both entities still aligned to a purpose, still communicating, trusting, and being able to do what you like, what you love. If you don't love what you do, why are you doing it in the first place? And I think this is what a lot of organizations and employees have started to see. Why do I need to do that 9-to-5 job and burn myself out and just be stressed all the time? There's better options out there. But how do we ensure that those better options are not the better options, taking away the human element, right? Mm. So human resources is definitely going through a lot of, I wouldn't say complexity as such, yes, in how to keep these different units and silos and effects but it's also about promoting that work-life balance, fostering the right environment, ensuring your leaders understand that feedback is important. Having a conversation is important in the work context, and it doesn't have to always be work-wise. How's your family? Yeah. How are you feeling today? Is there anything you need from me? Just something as simple as that opens up those doors of communication and connection.
I think this goes back to David's comment about we had this kind of false dichotomy of work life, as if our work isn't an integral and central part of our lives. And if we play into that dichotomy, which is why I've never really liked the term work-life balance, maybe just because I'm terrible at it, but it's as if we're trying to compartmentalize and divide ourselves from ourselves. And that, to me, seems like really at the root of the issue. Ekta, I want to ask you about Jeremy's comment, and Jeff, I also want to ask you about Jeremy's comment. How is this, interestingly, Ekta, you and Chantal, in some ways you might say, well, we both work in a people-centered business, but in healthcare, it seems like often the measure of success isn't really how do your clients, patients feel emotionally, whereas in Chantal's, it's very much the measure of success is emotional. Ekta, what are you seeing about Jeremy's question? Whoops, you're muted, I think.
I see where Jeremy is coming from. Appreciative inquiry has way more significance in today's world where we operate, because appreciative inquiry is trying to find out what's good, right? Appreciative inquiry is trying to focus on the positive, right? And the ideal state. Where would you want to be, right? Human-centered design, all of these things. I think, if you tie back to the conversation that was ongoing on why is engagement low and what can you do about it and why has it dropped, and the human connection, right? I think one of the biggest things in healthcare, and if you bring in the emotional intelligence piece in it, is how are you balancing your head and heart? That's what emotional intelligence is about, right? Emotional intelligence is not just about heart. It's about balancing your head and heart for optimal decision making, keeping the future in mind, being aware of your emotions and being aware of the emotions of others. So if you talk about patients, I would a little bit not extremely disagree, but I would certainly emphasize that emotions do play a role. Patient emotions do play a role in how we assess our service delivery. Assessing and measuring patient experience, a huge component of that experience is driven by emotions. So if organizations are not emphasizing on that emotional factor in measuring patient experience, then we are not doing ourselves any good in even having that measurement in place. Now, when it comes to the overall environment, the challenge in healthcare is we are driven by humanitarian purpose. We are driven by humanitarian cause. Actually, that's the purpose we exist, or ideally, that's why we should say we exist, right? Is to serve the humanity. It's a life and death situation where we are dealing with on a regular basis. But what ends up happening is, because of the complexity and the chaos, right, of performing in that area, which was worsened by the pandemic, right? We kind of, regardless of the fact that we are in a profession of empathy and compassion, we lost touch with that, because you get in the just the pace of providing care and somehow get disconnected with the emotional side of it until you start talking about it and resurfacing it. So I think where we are right now is all the conversations that are going on around empathy and compassionate cultures, those organizations that have literally embraced it, have understood very well how to pace yourself in care delivery, right? When you're connecting yourself to the patient. Those organizations that have more work to do, certainly understanding, the concepts that are like appreciative inquiry, human-centered design, really needs a reflection. It needs a reflection of, it's not a program. I keep emphasizing, we keep launching programs, right? And keep training based on programmatic approach. And within that programmatic approach, we lose the human connection because it becomes a program, right? It becomes a training program, and it becomes, okay, now we've trained you, go apply these skills. It's a muscle, right? And it has to be part of the culture. The leaders have to exemplify it. That has to be throughout the organization. Change the way you operate, change the way you connect with each other, change the way you talk to the patients. And that's not a program, right? So I think that's where the component of emotional intelligence becomes so much more important. How do you change it from a programmatic perspective to being a muscle that's practice, practice, practice? This is how you operate, and this is how you work with your patients and with your employees.
So there's this deep relational shift that David talked about. And then we were trying to do it at scale. And Jeff, I think this piece of kind of, is this relational stuff in the way of efficiency? In your former employee, we grappled with this a lot. Like the idea that like it was do. And somehow if we stopped and asked people how they were feeling and we built deeper relationships, it sort of somehow took away from efficiency. What's your sense about this? Is a more relational approach? People say, oh, I don't have time for that.
Yeah. I'll get a little bit.
Did your blood pressure just go up?
Yeah. I'm a bit personal right now with everybody. David, I was the guy that didn't break windows. I tore the whole buildings down in my previous career, the early parts when I was in operations. Every compliance, as Ekta talked about, if you made a process and put a compliance measurement on it, I would exceed it. It was just the finish line at all costs. So I didn't really care if it was outside of my building, if I offended everybody, because I controlled everything in my building. That's how I thought. When the question comes up about EI, open space, and the things, what really resonated me and was my aha moment back in 2004 when we went through all this is these are learnable skills. I don't know if I can get any better. I don't know that I can get any smarter. I don't know if I can raise my IQ. There's some upskilling to that. But emotional intelligence, human-centered design, these are all learnable if we're dedicated to learning, if we're willing to step out of who we are and look at who we are and be introspective and learn our patterns and really deal with what's going on, not only with yourself, but those around you. And the greatest thing about this is we all have emotions. It's not like we're not going to have to deal with them. So I may not fly a plane. I may not need the skills to fly a plane, so I don't have to deal with that. I may not do surgery. I may not need the skills to do surgery, and you probably don't want me doing surgery. But I have to deal with how I handle people every day and how I take care of my family, how I take care of myself. And that's why it's so important that we do spend the time and everybody realizes we can make a difference if we'll just pay attention and learn these skills that are out there and available for us. So that was my big aha moment from this, Josh.
In large organizations like where you used to work, there is this tendency to, as Adam's put here in this comment, kind of have this cog in a machine mechanistic approach. And the idea of kind of shifting away from this mechanistic approach, I mean, even the term human resources sort of is humans are resources. And, we talk about roles and functions and, we talk about users. Patients is sort of people, but somehow they're not people, they're not human beings. And I wonder if this kind of fundamental shift towards, well, this is a human experience, not something outside our human experience. David, you were talking about that earlier, so maybe we could come back to you. Is that insane in a business context?
Not at all. One of the things I've certainly learned over the last 3 years is that almost all suffering comes from unexpressed emotion. And we are dealing with a huge seismic shift in culture and what we're going through as a country and as the world. And people have a lot of unexpressed emotion, and that's going to build up, and it's what creates a lot of the challenges that we have. And so I think we have no choice but get to a world where people have enough emotional fluidity, meaning they know how to move it through the actual emotion, and fluency, meaning they can actually talk about it with other people and see what's going on and have more empathy and curiosity. And so I really don't see any other path than to confront this directly and get to a place where people are not the resources, the cogs in the machine, as the person mentioned, but are the nodes in the network, and those nodes have to be functioning in a healthy way, and that means understanding how to, work with emotions. And humans tend to kind of work at the intellect level a lot, right? But that is the tip of the iceberg, right? It's the massive thing underneath, the unconscious, where all the emotions are, where all the images and history and patterns and childhood stuff, all that stuff is kind of drives a lot of what we do, but we're really not good at understanding what's actually happening with it. And I think it creates a lot of problems. So I would love to see a world where we're just doing a lot more inner work together as teams and as companies, and that people become a lot more, not just the leaders becoming more emotionally intelligent to work. I don't think that model works very well. I think everybody collectively has to be more versed in the emotional fluidity and connections that are going to serve the larger purpose of the organization over the long run.
Okay, now we know exactly why our mutual friend Jay said you need to meet David. Because that is, of course, what 6 Seconds Work is about, is a global movement to have everyone in the world more emotionally intelligent. Just a small ambition.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I want one of my people to come to me and say, so sorry, I busted out yesterday. I was experiencing transference with stuff that I went through with my father, and here's what happened. Like, that would be great if we can get to that world.
Well, and I just want to go to Mike's comment about you get what you measure. Right. And Abner alluded to this earlier. If what we're measuring is this, it used to be this quarter's stock price, and now it's like this minute's stock price. We're getting more and more short term in our measures of success. And the measures of success are often antithetical to trust and connection and purpose and meaning. So how do we put those things into our dashboard? How do we make sure that people have that kind of data as part of the way they measure success? Anyone? Well, I know Jeff has an answer. Abner, go.
Well, I was just going to chime in, and this conversation is making me think that there really may be an opportunity here to do more in terms of investing in and to create the kind of work environments that David talked about, and maybe the kind of global environment that you're talking about, Joshua. And I love Jeff's comment that it's learnable. So there's hope, that if it weren't learnable, we'd have a different situation, right? But it is learnable. And so if you sort of think about, as I'm thinking about, well, the pandemic is a big part of what's driving a lot of the conversation here. The pandemic forced companies to really invest in technology in order for us to be able to communicate and to do business. Zoom is an example, but there's just the digitization that we had to implement and to invest in was required, and companies, just had to do it. It could very well be that as we now move into the next phase of the post-pandemic, it's going to become clear to more and more companies that the investment in emotional intelligence, investment in creating the kind of workplaces that we're talking about that will lead to, and maybe even and are necessary for the kind of productivity that we want to get, and that productivity ultimately leads to the kind of profitability that we're under pressure. I'm thinking of this as, how would I talk to my investors? I have investors, and how would I talk to them about investing in developing the emotional intelligence of not just the managers, to David's point, but the whole organization. I've got to make the connection between that investment and productivity and ultimately profitability. I think we may be entering a phase where making that argument is easier. It was a lot harder before we ended up with the kind of work environment and the expectations Chantal and Ekta both talked about of employees now. It may become easier for us to make the you might call it the financial case for investing, because this is going to take investment. Yes, it's learnable to Jeff's point, but it's not free. It's not like you could just, we've got to see this as a priority and actually invest real dollars. But in order to do that, we're going to have to make the case that this is what's necessary for the new work environment that we're trying to create. Not because we just want it, but because it's necessary for us to have the kind of productive work environments that we're all talking about. So this is making me optimistic, even though we're talking about something very challenging. Maybe there is a chance here for us to be successful in making that argument in a way that we just couldn't before.
Yeah, Jeff, one of your favorite graphics in our new business case is this cycle of loss and how companies are bleeding money by not having emotional intelligence. So how would you advise Abner to go to his investors and make this case?
Well, as you look at the loss categories, lost revenue, lost productivity, higher turnover, higher healthcare, businesses on average are spending about $2,500 to $2,600 a year on their employees in different types of benefits programs, employee assistance programs that could probably, you could transfer that expense into some of these programs if you did focus more on emotional intelligence, because right now, if you turn an employee over, it costs you about $4,500 to replace it for hiring firms, drug testing, whatever you need to do, recruiters. If you can reduce your turnover by 2 to 3 to 4%, you can almost fund any one of these programs. And that's what you don't see. But the investment in the executives, and I think David said it just can't be an executive program. And a lot of times when we do cultural, we do this emotional intelligence, this edict comes out from executive and they think everything's solved. And then they get out of that circle of chaos. But what happens is it becomes a compliance program. And now not only you still haven't invested the $2,500 in employees for employee assistance programs, now you've layered on another $1,000 per employee for an emotional intelligence program that becomes a compliance program. So when we talk about learnable, there has to be that genuine, and I think David always talked about, there has to be that genuine intention. There has to be the purpose behind it. And I think if you can align the purpose, I think there's more than enough cases, and we'll help you find them if you don't find them, but there's more than enough business cases to show this is a very sustainable investment. It's a very cost-effective investment. But more importantly, when it becomes learnable, we teach you how to fish. So this shouldn't be an investment that's ongoing with new expenses every year. It should be a sustainable program that starts growing itself. So that would be my answer to that. Hope we have a chance to have those conversations with a lot of people out there, but I believe in it. I've changed my life because of it. I've changed my career because of it. And this is definitely the way to go.
I want to just double click on what you just said with Jeremy's comment here is as soon as it starts becoming transactional, we lose the value. And I think that's one of the big challenges, again, of doing this at scale. As soon as we start saying, well, we're going to check off the box whether you did this or not, we're back to that mechanistic model. And we really need a different way of thinking about motivation. Well, folks, somehow we are at the end of our hour, and I'd like to just go down our list and ask each of you to share with us what is your key takeaway from today. What are you leaving this conversation with? So Daniel's going to just choose who goes first, and we'll just go down the list. So who's got a takeaway? It looks like David's going to go first.
I didn't have one, but I will just say that I am inspired by the people here who are working at a scale much bigger than what I work with a lot of times, and seeing that the levels of openness to new ways of connecting as humans, amidst the massive proliferation of data and automation and AI and everything else that's happening, it could easily drown out the human. So it's really nice to see that there is a discourse on an equal and opposite investment into the emotional, again, fluency and fluidity of the people who are serving our organizations. So grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Ekta, how about you?
So I'll say one of the things that is very clear to me with this discussion is there's more work to do. There's work to be done. And that work to be done starts with introspecting and reflecting on why what we've done so far isn't working, right? If you talk about engagement being the lowest, and we've invested so much in engagement, and we've done so much in regards to how do we drive human connection, and we've failed, if that's, I know I'm taking it to an extreme, but if that's the reality, introspection, reflection, and then identifying and accepting, actually acknowledging we need to shift how we operate and the solutions we are trying to bring forth. I think that introspection, reflection, if done genuinely, can help businesses and leaders to really, really find solutions that work.
Chantal. Whoops, Chantal, we're having a little technical glitch, so we'll try you again in a second. Jeff, let's go to you for a moment.
Yeah, I'm just thankful. What a great panel this has been. It's just energized me to hear others see. You always hope there's other people that see the world the way you do. And just in this panel today, it's just energized me that there's so much hope out there. And I want to really appreciate all the panelists for taking this and spending this hour with us today. It was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. All right, Chantal, let's see if your connection is stabilized.
Great. So a couple of things here. In order to have an impact, you're going to need to invest. And when you invest, have the right intention behind that investment, but also get the interest and start from the bottom up. Don't go top to bottom. You're going to have to start at that lower level because those are the ones that feel it and do it. And that's what I leave you with.
Abner.
Sure. I'll just double click on Chantal's comment. I think this is a moment of opportunity because the need is becoming so clear that I think we're not going to be able to avoid seeing it, and that makes it easier to make the business case, the investment case for investing in programs that can raise the bar when it comes to emotional intelligence, not just for senior leaders, but for the whole organization. So, sometimes, what do they say about, lemons and lemonade? Some good, the pandemic forced us to do some things that we needed to do. A lot of horrible things happened, but some good things came out of it, particularly from the technology perspective and the uptake of technology. And I'm hopeful that one of the additional things that comes out of it is the willingness to invest so that we can make the technologies that we have to use now more effective for our organizations. And I think key to that is emotional intelligence, but we've got to make the investment, which means we've got to convince investors and others to do that. So I'm appreciative of this conversation because I think it's a step in that direction.
Well, I will just continue in that theme and say we are in a new context. And if we keep trying to use the old systems and solutions, the stuff that we thought was pretty effective in, 2015, we're in trouble. And so it's time for all of us to upskill. It's time for all of us to grow. These are learnable, measurable, scientifically grounded skills. Emotional intelligence works. We have tons of data that shows that it's learnable and it's transformational for individuals and organizations. And so if you're in a place of saying, look, I recognize that there's been a sea change, and in this sea change, I've got to develop more strengths in these areas. But you're in the right place. Thank you for being here today. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thanks everybody who's participated live and who's watched. We'd love to have you like and follow, comment, engage, participate, and we'll see you again for another EQ Biz Live, talking about culture, organizational transformation, and how we build organizations that are truly successful for all of the stakeholders that are involved. Have a great day.